Hey everyone, today we are talking about the Soviet-Afghan War. A brutal, complex conflict that lasted from 1979 to 1989, marked by intense guerrilla warfare, Cold War politics, and a fight for survival in the mountains of Afghanistan. Today, we'll dive into why this war started, how it unfolded, and the consequences that continue to shape the world. To understand this war, let's first get some context. Afghanistan in the 1970s was already a challenging place. It was a poor, mountainous country, largely tribal, and ruled by a monarchy. But things changed in 1973 when a military coup replaced the monarchy with a republic under Daud Khan. Then in 1978, yet another coup by a communist party, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA, came to power. This new government was determined to modernize Afghanistan, but it quickly ran into problems. The PDPA was aggressive in pushing reforms, especially on social and land issues, which caused backlash in rural areas. Most of the population was deeply religious and traditional, and they didn't want what they saw as forced socialism and secularism. This resistance would eventually grow into a larger movement, the Mujahideen. By 1979, the Afghan government was struggling to control the growing rebellion. The PDPA had asked for Soviet help, and fearing a destabilized Afghanistan on its southern border, the Soviet Union decided to intervene. In December 1979, Soviet troops entered Afghanistan. They were officially there to support the Afghan government, but really, it was a military occupation. The Soviets hoped to stabilize Afghanistan, secure their influence, and prevent the spread of Islamist movements that could inspire unrest within their own Muslim-majority areas. The arrival of Soviet forces escalated the conflict. Afghan resistance fighters, known as the Mujahideen, banded together to fight back. And soon, the Cold War superpower rivalry took center stage. The United States saw an opportunity here. They wanted to contain Soviet influence and weaken their forces without direct confrontation. This was classic Cold War strategy. Through Operation Cyclone, the U.S., along with Pakistan and other allies, began funding, training, and arming the Mujahideen. The U.S. provided weapons like the Stinger missiles, which could take down Soviet helicopters, a game changer for the Mujahideen. And let's not forget, this support was covert. The U.S. wanted plausible deniability. This war was unlike anything the Soviets had experienced. Afghanistan's mountainous terrain and rough climate made conventional warfare difficult. Mujahideen fighters were often local tribesmen who knew the land and could move quickly, hitting Soviet forces with guerrilla tactics and then retreating to the mountains. The Soviets, meanwhile, used overwhelming force, including bombing campaigns, to try to root out the insurgents. But despite their superior technology, the Soviets couldn't maintain control of rural areas. Every time they seemed to gain ground, the Mujahideen slipped back into the mountains or crossed into Pakistan, where they had safe havens as with many wars. Civilians bore the brunt of the conflict. It's estimated that over 1 million Afghan civilians died, millions more fled their homes, creating a massive refugee crisis. By the mid-1980s, about 5 million Afghans were living as refugees in neighboring countries, mostly Pakistan and Iran the war's effects on. Afghan society were devastating schools, infrastructure, and entire villages were destroyed. Children grew up amid violence and uncertainty, with little education and limited opportunities. This legacy would have lasting consequences. As the 1980s wore on, the Soviet Union was getting bogged down in Afghanistan. They faced mounting casualties, low morale among troops, and an increasingly critical international community. Meanwhile, back home, the Soviet economy was struggling, and political pressures were building when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985. He realized that the Afghan war was a quagmire they couldn't win. In 1988, the Geneva Accords were signed, which paved the way for the Soviet withdrawal. The last Soviet troops left Afghanistan in February 1989, nearly a decade after the war had begun. The Soviet-Afghan War had far-reaching consequences. For Afghanistan, the war left a power vacuum, setting the stage for civil war. Different Mujahideen factions, which had been united against the Soviets, now fought each other for control. By the mid-1990s, the Taliban would rise from this chaos, eventually taking over much of Afghanistan for the Soviet Union. The war was a costly mistake. It drained resources, weakened the economy, and shook public confidence. Many historians believe that this war contributed to the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. In the decades following the Soviet withdrawal, Afghanistan continued to struggle with conflict and foreign interventions. The U.S. would eventually find itself entangled in Afghanistan as well, partly due to the emergence of groups like Al-Qaeda, which formed in the aftermath of the Soviet-Afghan War. The Soviet-Afghan War serves as a reminder of the complexities of foreign intervention, the resilience of local resistance movements, and the unintended consequences that can arise when superpowers attempt to impose their will on smaller nations. Even today, Afghanistan's story is one of a country caught in the crossfire of global power struggles, with a population that continues to seek peace. And that brings us to the end of our look at the Soviet-Afghan War, a conflict that lasted 10 years, but with impacts that have stretched over decades. It's a story of resilience, tragedy, and a harsh lesson in the costs of war. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments what other historical events you'd like us to cover.